Hi everyone, Stepan here. I'll continue the series on the Pirc's defense with the Austrian Attack, which is the most aggressive and most popular way to fight the hyper-modern Pirc. If you haven't seen the introductory video, please do see it before you continue to make sure you have an understanding of the basics of the opening and all the common variations. And here we are going to cover the Austrian Attack in detail. So, e4, d6 the Pirc defense. The following moves are pretty much mandatory. d4, taking up the center, because with the hyper-modern openings, such as the Pirc or the King's Indian defense, black is giving up the center to white. He is preparing to fianchetto his bishop on the king side to castle, and then to crash through the center with the move c5 and d5. And the most principled way for white to continue is to take that center. So d4, knight to f6, knight to c3, defending the e4 pawn, g6, preparing to fianchetto, and now the Austrian attack with f4. The other variations we are going to go over in the next videos. So the move f4 is fairly straightforward. It sort of shows the cards for white, and the move is twofold. Firstly, it's designed to create a kingside attack, and secondly, it's designed to support the move e5, which is white main advance in this variation. And when white, or if white gets the move e5 in, then white is going to have a vast advantage in space in the center of the board, which could be crucial. And another key thing is that once the pawn is placed on e5, this bishop is sort of dampened and its scope is significantly reduced. So the move e5 is definitely one of the main purposes of the move f4. Furthermore, the move sort of restricts black pieces already, and the move gives white much more space at the start. And if black allows you with his hyper-modern style to take the center, you should take it. So arguably the move f4, the Austrian attack, is the most principled way for white to continue. Here the only move for black is bishop to g7, white plays knight to f3. All of these moves, these two moves, are going to be played all the time. There's nothing better for either side. And here black gets to choose. Here black can either castle or play the move c5. Now, the move c5 sort of goes against the principles of the opening, even though it's not a bad move. Usually, black should castle, put his king to safety, and only then open up the center with the move c5. But if black doesn't do that now, in some variations with castling, there's a chance that he isn't going to be able to do that at all. So, the move castles is the main move. And I think it's the safer option, but probably the better option as well. Here white has four different replies: bishop to e3, e5, bishop to d3, and bishop to e2. I think that bishop to e3 is quite an interesting sideline, so we are going to go over that first. Bishop to d3 is the main move, the vice variation. So after castles, bishop to e3 is, well, preparing to castle queenside, which I really like in this variation. And even though your bishop is sometimes going to be vulnerable to knight attacks from g4, and there's a chance that you might lose this bishop and therefore not be able to exchange it on h6 for black's main defender, regardless of that, I think that castling queenside gives white tremendous chances here, and h4, h5, etc. Black here continues with b6, fianchettoing his queenside bishop as well. This is the main move, creating a lot of light squared weaknesses, but they're pretty irrelevant in this position. Queen to d2, preparing to castle queenside, bishop b7, and now e5, gaining space, dampening the bishop on g7. And I just love this position for white. Of course, bishop takes f3 isn't really a threat, because white is castling queenside anyway, so having doubled pawns on the f-file could actually be very useful, preventing the knight from jumping into g4, so this is never a threat. So black continues with knight to g4 immediately, and black basically will take the bishop. There's nothing white can do. Retreating to g1 would be just ridiculous. So castles, and here black doesn't capture immediately, black pushes through with c5, and here you can see, well, this is probably the most visual variation of the Pirc, and probably my favorite, this Kuraitsa variation with bishop to e3, because both sides are forcing their plans without well, without being stopped, and there's nothing the other side can do. So white managed to achieve two things he wanted. He has a broad center with an advanced pawn on e5 blocking out the bishop, and he also has a potential for a huge kingside attack. On the other hand, black has castled and black has challenged the center with the move c5, trying to break open white's bind on the central squares. Here the best move for white is dc5, and after bc5, bishop c5, a temporary pawn sacrifice for black, and of course you can't take because the queen is hanging, so queen to a5, bishop to a3, and now d takes e5. Here black gets the pawn back. Here the main move is knight to d5, taking fe5 is losing, because if you take then bishop to h6, and after, let's say, knight to g5 and this happens, you're going to be lost. So taking on e5 doesn't work, so after d takes e5, knight to d5 is the main move, trying to bring the knight into the center, challenging the e7 pawn and causing a lot of problems for black. Here black's best idea is to exchange the queens, and the game continues from here. The engines give it as better for white, +1 or more, and I completely understand that. If you look at these two pieces, they are yet to be developed. White, of course, still has two pieces to develop, but it's sort of easier to play because you have more control. These three pieces are very active. Black should never really exchange this bishop for the knight, and this knight could be easily chased away. After that, this pawn is even hanging. So I think this variation, the Kuraitsa variation, is very good for white. Another move after bishop a3, d takes e5 is h3, simply chasing the knight away, and now after knight to h6, you can now take on e5 and dissolve this center, which could be causing you some trouble, and the e7 pawn is hanging as well in some positions. So the Kuraitsa variation is very interesting. e5, the Unziker attack is, I would say, premature, because you get to play e5 in most variations anyway, and I would prefer developing my minor pieces first before pushing through with d5. But still, d5, f takes e5, the point of playing f4, knight to d5, bishop c4, bishop e6 defending the knight, knight d5, bishop d5, bishop d5, queen d5, and now queen to e2. White has traded off a lot of pieces, which means that he isn't going to have such a strong attack, and that's why the Unziker variation, even though it's seemingly most aggressive with an early e5, I would say isn't as good for white, because you play the Austrian attack to crush black, not to trade off the pieces. And now, even though this bishop is worse than this bishop, it's not really clear where the c1 bishop is going to be as useful to prove the bad positioning of the bishop on g7. So I really don't think this variation is as good. The engines give it as better for white as in every variation of the Pirc, plus 0.5, 0.6, but it's nothing major, and with a move such as f5, black is going to be able to break through the center and crush this e5 pawn and just continue from there. Black's main idea here is b5, trying to undermine this way and then to play f6, but I mean, after castles, knight e6, c3, f6, ef6, ef6, you can see that this center is sort of crumbling and it's not as secure as it might have seemed after the move f4. So this center could be a liability as well, and the Unziker attack is the easiest way to go wrong. Not that it's a bad opening, I mean, it's better for white, but I think that the other variations are more favorable. Here after bishop g7, knight to f3 castles, another sideline is bishop to e2, which I can understand. It's sort of a combination of the classical and the Austrian. You're waiting to use your pawn majority, but this now gives black time for an immediate c5, breaking open the center, dc5, queen a5. Black is of course never going to capture this way. Black's main idea is to play queen to a5 and then to take. And now after castles, queen takes c5, king to h1, knight to c6, a normal opening. White's idea will be either to play f5 or to play e5 when the situation is right and try to open up the king side, but I'm not sure that this move bishop to e2 is as significant, and I think that this variation is sort of a sideline which you should know with black if you play the Pirc, and which you should learn to be able to parry it, but I'm not sure it's as challenging. And the main line after castles is the move bishop to d3. This is called the vice variation, and now black has two moves. He can either play knight to a6 or knight to c6. Knight to a6 is great because the knight can then come to b4 and cause some trouble in the center, harassing this bishop, defending the d5 square, coming back into c6 if necessary, and putting pressure on the c2 square. So knight to a6 is the main line. Knight to c6 is a sideline which is okay, and here white chooses between castles and d5, which is often a choice, and in the Austrian attack and in other variations of the Pirc, black is going to have a choice between c5 and castle, and white is going to have a choice between e5 and castles. And here I think castles is the principled way to play. Castles e5 for black is allowed, of course, so if after knight to c6 you play e5 immediately, black isn't going to be able to play it. So you sort of have to decide what you want to do. So after knight to c6 in the vice variation, if you want to make sure that you get the central control and central space with e5, then play it immediately, because if you castle, black is going to play e5, and after f5, d5, d5, you will have advanced your d-pawn, which is arguably even better for blocking out this bishop, but you've sort of killed off your bishop as well, and your bishop on d3 doesn't have as much scope. So now knight d4 is the main move, a bit of tactics here, knight e5, knight e4, this knight is hanging, so it's okay, knight e4, bishop e5. The center is dissolved, white doesn't have as much control, but after the move such as c4, white is going to be fine, and I think that the fact that the f-file is open favors white. On the other hand, your knight isn't on f3, and the queen coming to h4 could cause you a lot of problems. So after the move knight to c6, castles is fine, e5 is fine as well, you don't allow black to play e5, so now d5, f5, knight h5, bishop to e3, bishop to g4. Well, a lot could be said about this variation as well. I mean, in the castles line, the center gets sort of dissolved, and in this line with e5, the center is more of a liability, I would say, because now already in some positions white is threatened to lose the d4 pawn because there are too many attackers on it. So let's say if white does nothing here, then bishop takes, queen takes, and this pawn is in trouble. So yeah, you have to be careful here. So knight to c6 is a sideline to look out for, and definitely a worthy mention because it does put pressure on the d4 pawn immediately. But as I said, knight to a6 is the main line. And here white can once again choose between castles and e5. Castles is by far the most popular move. e5 once again is fine, and in this line it might be better because the knight isn't on c6. So now knight to d7, bishop to e3 developing, knight to b4, as I said, putting pressure on your bishop. That's one advantage of having your knight on a6. Castles, knight takes d3, queen takes d3, c6. This is probably my favorite way to play with white, and this is probably my favorite variation against the Pirc. And I think that in the main line with knight to a6, and this is the main line of the Austrian attack, I think white stands better. The engines give it as a small advantage, but I think it's just much easier to play. It's really not clear what the g7 bishop is doing. It's not clear how the d7 knight is going back into the game. Of course, it could go via b6 and d5, but it will take some moves. And in the meanwhile, all the white pieces are harmonically developed. The rook is coming either to d1 or to e1. And white has finished his development. And you can see that black still has to move two pieces. And the bishop is going to take some moves to develop too. So this line is great, I would say. So after knight to a6, I would advise the move e5. And after e5, the knight can't really go to h5. d7 is much better. Bishop e3, knight b4, castles. Knight takes d3, queen takes d3, c6. Black has wasted some tempi with knight a6 to b4, knight b4 takes d3. And you can see that in the meanwhile, white has developed while black kept moving one of his pieces around. And after knight to a6, castles is another move. e5, I would say, is the best and most aggressive, but castles is another way to play. After castles, black, of course, plays c5, breaking through the center. Remember this with the black pieces. If you can, play c5, open up the center. e5 is another idea, but I think in this position, c5 is much better. c5, and white continues with d5, blocking out the center. Bishop to g4, pinning the knight. Bishop c4. Knight c7, rerouting the knight back, and black is often going to have a plan of e6, undermining this way and bringing his knight back into the center. h3, chasing the bishop away. There's nothing better but to take, takes, e6, undermining the center, d6, fe6, and now bishop to e3. And, this is considered to be the main line of the Austrian attack of the vice variation. Once again, black's center is a liability here, more so than white's, and white is going to have a hard time breaking through it anyway. So one of the plans is to simply double up your rooks on the d file and use the fact that this pawn is so weak. One common plan is to play a4 to stop any b5s, dislodging your defenders of the d5 square. And if you can manage to double up your rooks, perhaps play e5 when the situation is right, when d5 isn't possible, then you're going to be great. c5, the c5 pawn is weak. There are even tricks of, let's say, rook a to d1. You're already threatening bishop takes c5. So there's a lot of play in this position. And the Pirc is a great opening because it gives both sides a lot of chances. More so to white, and even the engines agree, but black has a lot of play. Okay, and the other move after f4, bishop g7, knight f3, if black doesn't castle, it's for him to play the immediate c5, which is far more aggressive and far less safe. Here, white has two moves, either bishop b5 check, which is the main line and the most principled move, or dc5. After dc5, which is okay, queen to a5, bishop d3, queen c5, queen to e2, preparing to dislodge the queen this way. I think the queen is misplaced, and the queen is often misplaced on the c5 square, and it's going to be a tempo gain for the bishop. So here black castles, bishop e3, queen to a5, castles, bishop g4. Once again, compare the development. White is a tempo up, and the white's pieces are just perfect. On the other hand, in these lines where black plays the immediate c5, opening up the center and forcing dc, this bishop doesn't have that many problems. So for the players with the black pieces, after knight to f3, I think I would recommend the move c5, because c5 indirectly helps your bishop be more active. So c5, dc5, queen a5, bishop d3, queen takes here. Castles, bishop e3, queen a5, castles, bishop g4 is better for white, but I think black has much more chances because this bishop is more active. And these lines with c5 are called the dragon formation, because you can see that it's similar to the Sicilian dragon. When c5 and dc5 happen, this pawn structure is actually completely identical. After queen to e2, here, black doesn't have to castle. Black can play the immediate bishop g4 and castle afterwards, but the lines transpose. And if not dc5, after c5, white has another option, which I think is better, bishop b5 check, developing a piece with tempo, bishop to d7, blocking out the check. That's the main move. You can take, but it's a sideline, which I think isn't as popular. This is a pawn sacrifice, but just temporary, because you can see that there are problems on c3. So after bishop takes d7, knight f d7 is the best move, opening up the bishop to make sure you can play b5, d5, b5, knight takes b5, and now queen to a5 check, forcing the knight to c3, and black regains the pawn. I mean, it's okay, both sides stand well, I would say. So bishop takes d7 is a sideline which I wouldn't recommend for white, because you sort of have a very aggressive, uneven game for both sides with a lot of tactical possibilities, and as white in the Austrian attack you want to have a peaceful advantage. So after bishop to d7, I wouldn't advise you to take the bishop. I would advise you to play the move e5. And what this does is that now if you ever take, there's no queen to a5 check, because the knight can simply return to c3 and there are no problems with the bishop. So the move e5 is much more principled. Here black continues with bishop to g4, and now e6. And here there's another move, taking on d7 as I said, but e6 is the main line, and in some cases it leads to a perpetual check, but it's a very aggressive way for white to play, and it could surprise the players who play the Pirc defense. But let's look at bishop takes d7, which is probably the more human way to play. So bishop takes, queen takes, d5, d5, h3, e4, knight e4, knight f6. There's no more center for white. But after bishop takes d7, queen takes d7, d5, d5, of course you can't take with the f-pawn because it's defended twice. h3 is the only move, so there's nothing more you can do. e4 by black is a tactical move and the best move, so knight e4, knight f6, knight takes f6, bishop takes f6, castles, brings the position to something around equal. I'm not sure which side I would prefer, and this is a messy position, so the engines give it as plus 0.5, plus 0.6 for white, and the good news for white is that he gets the move c4 in. If it was black to play, then the move c5 would be a serious move, and then after b5 black would have stopped the defense of this pawn. So the position is roughly equal, nothing major for white, and that's why I would recommend the move e6. So after knight g4, e6, the bishop can't take, of course, f takes is forced, f e6, and now you play knight to g5. The bishop is still pinned, so this is a threat. And now, after bishop takes b5, something wonderful is going to happen. White doesn't recapture the piece. White threatens the queen. Knight takes e6. And now, if black messes up this position, then he could be in a lot of trouble. As you can see, the main move is here, giving up the queen. If black tries to defend, let's say queen here, then this is just losing. The queen is taking the knight is taking the bishop, we check, and black is in a lot of trouble. So there's no other move, you have to give up your queen. Bishop takes here, knight takes here, and now you're just a victim to a nasty perpetual check. And the knight and the two bishops form a great checking pattern, and there's nothing you can do. So the main line of the dragon formation in the Austrian attack is actually a forced draw, but both sides have to play perfectly to achieve that. And as white, you can study this and learn it by heart and be able to surprise your opponents fairly quickly. And I think most players with black are going to be very, very surprised after knight g4, e6 and f e6, knight g5. They're going to either spend a lot of time on their clock or just lose the position. You can already see that the move knight to g5 has also uncovered an attack on the knight, so it's very tactical. These two pieces form a great attacking pattern. Okay, let's just recap on the opening moves. So e4, d6, the Pirc, d4, knight f6, knight c3, g6, the forced moves, and the Austrian attack with f4. Preparing to play the move e5, going for a kingside attack, in some cases castling queenside, most often castling kingside. And black on the other hand wants to play bishop to g7, and then castle and play the move c5. So remember the main two pawn breaks. For black it's c5, for white is e5. If you play this position with white, remember that if you don't play e5, black might play e5, so you need to calculate that as well. Okay everybody, I hope you liked this video on the Austrian attack. Please do let me know what you think, and I'll continue with the Pirc defense next time. Thanks very much, and stay tuned for more chess. See you later, bye bye.